I decided not to have a slideshow. I could be prophetic and say that I did it for oral history reasons. I could be realistic and say it's because I didn't really plan a talk. And part of the reason why I didn't really want to plan something is because I knew that this would happen. I knew that I would get extremely overwhelmed with emotions, and I didn't want to rely on a PowerPoint when I knew that this would happen. I'm emotional for a few reasons. One is this is so beautiful. This is so powerful. When I walked in, late of course, because I'm Filipino, to see all of these folks here, all of you who are interested in Filipino American psychology and mental health issues is just really overwhelming. And so I'm so thankful for you all being here. And thank you so much to Alicia and Rochelle and to the planning committee. Again, one more round of applause for that. So as Alicia mentioned, I'm a professor of psychology at City University of New York. I'm also the second Filipino American Asian American Psychological Association president. I'm also the first openly queer queer Asian American Psychological Association president. And I just want to start by saying that I'm tired of being a first. And I say that because you should all be first as well. One, and two, because we shouldn't have to count how many times one of us does something that isn't that amazing per se, but is amazing because there are so many obstacles that get in the way from us being able to be those first. So I hope by the end of this conference that you think of a way that you can be the first and that you can encourage the seconds and the thirds and the fourth person to come in your place. As I was listening to the speakers so far, I thought, whoa, what if Adelinda did not write her dissertation? If she didn't write her dissertation, then Kuya Alvin might not have been inspired to write his dissertation, which might not have, or which led for me to write my dissertation. And so this whole chain of events that the things that you do that might seem sometimes very innocuous, sometimes treacherous and annoying to have to meet with your advisor and go through 10 drafts of a dissertation, that in itself, especially when you write about issues related to Filipino Americans and social justice, that is revolutionary. You sitting in a library writing about the research that has come from the past, as well as your ideas for where to go in the future, that is revolutionary. And so I hope that today, as you hear all of these speakers and all these wonderful things about where we've gone, that you think about where you want to go in the future. I thought to introduce my background a little bit. I am a second-generation Filipino American, born and raised in the East Bay here in the Bay Area. Anyone from the East Bay? 510. I'm fortunate enough to be a second generation with connections to the Manong generation. My parents immigrated in 1965, right after the Immigration Act and Naturalization Act of 1965. So they were among the first of that generation to come to the US. Because of that, they had no one here that they really could relate to or talk to. And so they heard of these distant relatives that worked in the farms, these distant relatives that had come 30, 40 years ago, many who were even born and raised in the United States. And so they found these communities, which I grew up with. I remember running around in the farms, not really understanding the significance of the land that I was on, and later appreciating having that experience, to be able to know what it's like to be the child of immigrants, while also knowing what it's like to have a connection to the history of Filipino Americans in the US. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in a very, very heavily populated Filipino American community. My high school was about 40% Filipino American, which means that 4 out of 10 people in my classroom were Filipino. In thinking about that or hearing about that, one might imagine that, oh, wow, you must have talked about Filipino things all the time. And the answer was, we did not. We had one Filipino American teacher who ironically taught, or coincidentally taught history, world history, but the curriculum that she was given did not allow for her to even mention the word Philippines in our history classes. So you have 40% of people in a room that are Filipino, with a large amount of people who are Chicano or Latino, and we're not learning anything about what it means to be a brown American person in the US, nor are we learning about the histories of our countries and our people in our native homelands. When I went to college at the University of California, Irvine, I also was fortunate enough to take an Asian American psychology class, and that class really changed the trajectory of the rest of my life. I never knew that I wanted to be someone who wanted to study ethnic psychology or multicultural psychology, and part of that is because I didn't know it existed. Part of it was because there weren't people who had told me that this was a possible route. And so having that class led for me to explore other types of cultural psychology, focusing on other groups, and this is where I realized this is what I want to do. And part of me wanted to, much like the speakers who have spoken already, wanted to focus on Filipino and Filipino American issues, because there was something that traditional Asian American psychology just wasn't quite getting. That yes, I understand what it means to be stereotyped in a way where you're either viewed as a model minority or a perpetual foreigner. And yes, I know what it's like to be the child of immigrant parents who came over post-1965 and to deal with some of those pressures that they might have put on me. But no, I don't know what it's like to be an East Asian American. I know what it's like to be a Pinoy, a brown Asian person in the United States who was often stereotyped in ways that East Asians were not or have not been. I was a student who was, as a high school student, pulled over by police more times than I can remember. I was a person who was followed around in stores. I was somebody who counselors discouraged from going to college, saying that, I think that maybe you should go to community college, and not that there's anything wrong with community college, but the message that I was receiving was that I don't think you're ready to go to a university. I have since emailed all the counselors and said, I got a PhD, where's yours? But those were the messages that I had. And then as I started reading the work of Linda and Lenny and Alvin and Maria Root, I'm so glad that you all brought up people like Maria Root and Uncle Roy Morales and Fred and Dorothy Cordova. All of those folks have really changed my life, whether I knew them personally or not. I never got to know Maria Root on a personal level, but her work changed my life. I fortunately did know Uncle Roy and Uncle Fred before they had passed, and they changed my life. So know that the people that you meet today and the people that that read your work or listen to you speak or are familiar with the type of things that you do, that you have an impact on the rest of their lives. Upon graduating from my undergrad, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I really thought, because I had no previous history of psychology majors or psychologists in my life, I thought that once I got my bachelor's degree that I would be a psychologist, because that's what happens, right? Little did I know that, 20 years later, I'd get my doctorate. No, just kidding. So a few years later, I got my master's degree. I went to Michigan State, primarily because they offered me a good funding package, but also because I thought, I just want to know what it's like to be a Pinoy in the Midwest. And I want to just have that risky experience. I want to step out of my comfort zone. And so I did that. And in retrospect, it probably wasn't the best idea. I went days without seeing Filipinos when I first got there, except for the one in the mirror. And And then at the same time, I learned so much about myself. I learned what it meant to be Filipino in the context of not having other Filipinos around you. I learned that being Filipino means that you drive miles away, far away, to be with other Filipinos, and that you create your own community. I also learned that regardless of how many Filipinos are in a room or in a community, that there are key things that tend to always be the same. Things that are more surface level, like yes, we're always late, and yes, we like pancit and adobo, but key core values like kapwa, this idea that when you meet a Filipino for the first time, that there is a connection between you. This idea of utang ng loob, where when you have a person in your life who you may or may not necessarily be practically close to, but there's a part of you that wants to help them, a part of you that feels this reciprocity, that we are all taking care of each other. I went to Teachers College, Columbia University for my doctorate, and I went there because I really wanted to study multicultural psychology. And so I worked with Daryl Wing Su, who, as you all know, was one of the founders of Asian American Psychological Association, as well as one of the pioneers in multicultural psychology in general. Through his work and through his modeling, I saw what was possible. I saw that if you really want something to be done, sometimes you have to do it yourself. If you see that there's something missing from research or literature, then you have to be the one to write it. If you don't see yourself in your history books, then you need to write your own history books. These are some of the things that over time I learned to develop, but I know that at first I didn't think was even possible. As I look back at my life and how my career has gone, I'm astonished. I had never thought that I was going to be where I am today. When I first walked into an Asian American Psychological Association convention, I was convinced that that was the last one I would ever go to. Because I walked in, I saw Alvin, hey, and I saw maybe one other Filipino. Later I would see EJ and Rochelle and Jocelyn Buhain. And you would literally be able to see each other from far away because you were like that one chocolate chip in the sea of cookie dough. And so we gravitated to each other and we found each other. During this time, I became very close with Dr. David, who's going to speak in a little bit. And together, like, we just said, we need to do something. We need to represent Filipinos. And then we found Rochelle and Jocelyn and Steph and went to our mentor, Alvin, and said, can we start this division on Filipino Americans? And what does this look like? How does this work? And so we found out it was relatively easy. You just needed to put together a petition and people needed to sign it. And so we did it, and then we were established, and like, now what? What do we do? I think our first year, our membership was like 20 people, which wasn't surprising because there were probably only 20 paid AAPA members who are Filipino. Out of our 500-person membership, we have very few Filipino Americans that are still part of the Asian American Psychological Association, despite the fact that we've now had 2 Filipino American presidents, that their current president is Filipino American. I went to the last Asian American Psychological Association conference, and I, the president, felt marginalized because there were no other Filipino American speakers. There were no other Filipino American related programs or research activities besides the DoFA lunch that was held. And so that was a wake-up call for me and for DoFA, that if the president is feeling marginalized in that space, what does that say about the organization? And so this is where that brainstorming happened, was at that lunch where we said, why don't we have a conference? Why don't we have it in the Bay Area, because there are hella Pinoys in California. And that's where we'll start. And then from there, we'll have people who are either psychologists or practitioners or clinicians who work with populations and deal with mental health issues, to students, and that's how we can expand. And so that was what our mission was. And just by being here today, I see that it's been working, and it's great to have you all here. I just want to end, because I know we're running out of time, because, Filipinos hella like to talk. Just to think about where we go from here. And I know that Dr. Alvarez has talked about that in what can you do to make sure that this conference happens again. And I want to take it even a step further. So not just what do we want to do to ensure that this conference happens again and that DoFA grows and that our network of Filipino American psychologists grows, but what are you doing to make sure that others know that Filipino American psychologists exist? What are you doing to represent the Filipino American issues and concerns and our constituents' concerns in the larger psychology community and even in a larger mainstream context? When we think about Filipinos and Filipino Americans, when it comes to mental health, there still is a strong stigma regarding mental health. My parents, they'll be the first to tell anybody that I'm a doctor, and then they'll say, oh, what kind of doctor? Oh, he's just a professor. Because psychology is still something that is so stigmatized. So what can we do to destigmatize psychology, particularly for Filipino Americans, especially because we know that Filipino Americans have so many different health issues and mental health issues that are all interconnected and that could not easily, but hopefully be solved, be minimized, be reduced if they just got the help that they needed. Perhaps we need to normalize this experience of going to seek mental health services. In the same way that you go to church on Sundays, you go to your therapist on Thursdays. That this is something that we need to practice and preach, and that we also need to model. I'm a very firm believer that if you are a psychologist who's afraid to talk about your own experiences with mental health or your own experiences in going to therapy, then you're essentially part of the problem in some ways because you are still internalizing that stigma and perpetuating that stigma instead of being that person to be the first, to be that open voice to tell everyone that seeking mental health treatment is okay. And then on the other hand, what are we doing as Filipino American psychologists to make sure that our voice is heard in the larger general society? What are we doing in the American Psychological Association? What are we doing in just mental health work in general? How many times have you at your job or your clinic suggested a workshop on Filipino American issues? How many times have you suggested that we have some competence trainings or some readings or something related to Filipino American issues, especially if you are in a clinic that has a large Filipino American population? Like Dr. Alvarez said, that if you don't do that, you don't speak up, it's not like a white person is going to say, oh, this is such a great idea, we need to serve this population. And maybe there might be one or two that might, but majority won't. And so you have to be the one to make those changes and those decisions, to decide to implement those changes. So I end with this, that I just am so excited to be here. I hope you all can really just allow yourself to feel today. I know that anytime I'm in spaces where you traditionally aren't allowed to be, or you have limited opportunities to be with others that are like you, that it's a very emotional, spiritual experience. But yet, because we're so used to conferences being so academic and so emotionless, that we don't allow ourselves to connect to those feelings. But I think that we should reach back to our indigenous roots, to our ancestors, to our kapwa, and just really make sure that this is a space that everyone feels supported, a space where everyone can feel the love, where we're not bound by the rigid rules of academia or of clinical practice, and the boundaries that we're taught are so bad and daunting in our practices, but that we really just allow ourselves to be. So with that, I say thank you, maraming salamat, and please talk to me if you have any questions, and I think I love you all. This is great. Take care. Peace out.